Welcome. I'm Julia.
And I am Marta.
And this is LateMode, a podcast in search of the zeitgeist. Through a series of conversations, we explore the fragmented and hyper-connected modes of our current times.
Welcome, Francisco Trento, on this podcast. Thank you so much for agreeing to have this conversation with me today. I appreciate it a lot. There's a few things that it might be nice for me to explain to you before we introduce you to possible listeners. So the first thing is what the name of the podcast means. So this podcast is called LateMode, a podcast in search of the zeitgeist. And the idea is that the zeitgeist, as the highly problematic notion that it is, might have become somewhat irrelevant today because we know that time is not linear and that there's different presents and future and pasts always taking place at the same time. So how do you define an eventual spirit of the age? And we thought, well, we don't know. We don't know if defining a spirit of the age is even interesting anymore, but we're definitely interested in what other people are up to in other parts of the world that do a different life than we have, but with similar interest. So me and my colleague Julia, who is the second host of this podcast, decided, why don't we do something like this? Each of us takes time to have slow conversations with people we're interested in, be it friends or practitioners or teachers that their work kind of touched us. We invite them on this podcast and we talk to them and we ask them, what's up? Where are you? What are you doing? How's your life? What are you working on? What are you worried about or having a mad rabbit hole research trip on? Tell us about your experience right now in your present and leave behind a theme. And this theme becomes a kind of a little thematic house that the person who comes in the podcast after you will inhabit with one of us. And so these themes make kind of a chain that connects all these different people that have been on this podcast. So we were given a theme by the previous guest. And this theme is sincere or sincerity. We can discuss this in whichever degree we like. It can be an inspiration or it can be something that we're like, I really don't know, let's think about this. Or it can just be something that maybe surfaces slowly. So that's it. That's our theme. And yeah, any thoughts just off the bat?
I mean, I think it speaks somehow, yeah, for sure. Like both in my life and in my research, we have been talking, I mean, before me and you about masking and I think it's quite connected to that.
Yeah, I thought the same.
I think for me, it's like quite tricky to not be sincere because I don't think it's like, I think it's too much of energy for me to not being sincere. Also the anxiety that it brings, like, oh, what if somebody will find that I was not sincere? So I think for me, it's just easier to be sincere because it's less energy that I spent in my body.
That's a very good point. I think too often we don't think about easy in terms of the energy you spend.
Yeah.
I think often we think about easy in terms of what is more readily available or comfortable or socially comfortable. Whereas usually it should be a process that comes from inward, like what gives me energy or what takes energy from me.
Yeah. And I think it's not like a moral point, like this idea that, okay, I think I'm just sincere mostly because it's easier for my body to, I mean, as a neurodivergent person, it's usually how it goes. Like, but of course that also can give us some, not problems, but like some barriers in the social environment. Like if we are too sincere about some things, like it's not that we are being like, I don't know, harsh or anything. It's just like, I think it's just easier if people would say what they really want. It's like these games are a bit complicated. Like, I mean, both love games, or other kinds of games that run in society are, I think, I don't know. I think they have their charm for some people, but I don't really grasp sometimes. Yeah.
I understand very well. I think I want to jump on so many things you said already, but I realize we haven't really given an introduction yet. And that's a bit how it went and how we met, right? Because Francisco Trento, who is my guest today, is a postdoc researcher at the University of Helsinki, correct?
Actually, it's a University of the Arts, Helsinki. It's another institution.
Thank you for correcting me. And you work in the fields of artistic research, and you have a career that started with film and media. But I met Francisco because of their work as a neuroqueer theorist in a way. Like I got introduced to neuroqueer terminology and what it means by Francisco's work, thanks to a totally random Instagram encounter. And so I'd be very, very interested to have you introduce yourself and to hear more about how you define your academic practice.
Yeah, so we met in this temporary gallery event, which is an institution that is in Cologne. It was an online event, and I also work as a social responsibility coordinator in this Frame Contemporary Art Finland. And in this job, we had a trip to Slovakia, and then I met people from the temporary gallery. So as they were doing some series of lectures on forms of kinship, they invited me to give this talk, or more like a conversation connected to neuroqueer intimacies. So I have a few focuses on my research. So I have this research that I do as a university researcher connected this SAFINET network, which is South African Finnish network for studies of health and well-being. And like on that particular task, I developed together with the South African partners some kind of research that analyzes how to develop policy changes regarding disability, health, and well-being in the arts education systems, both in Finland and in South Africa, trying to understand both health, disability, and well-being from conceptual frameworks that do not necessarily emerge from the global north. So that's like what I'm hired to do now. And I have been researching in this institution neuroqueerness and neurodiversity in the arts education since 2019. And that research continued for me right now. And so neuroqueerness is the intersection of both gender and sexual queerness with the neurodiversity, which is the spectrum of, well, it's the spectrum of all possible and potential modes of cognition in humanity. So, for instance, the neurodiversity movement does not understand that persons in a spectrum of autism or ADHD or other conditions, not as they lack something, but as part of natural human variability. And what happens is that there is some traditions from the behavioral studies from the 60s and the 70s that kind of imprinted this very male subjectivity to persons in the spectrum of neurodiversity. A big part of neurodivergent people are both gender queer and non-straight. And actually, when I met the work of this Remi Giorgio, a researcher from the States, they discuss a lot how the position of being neurodivergent is similarly has some particularities that connected to queerness. Queerness not only being connected to sexuality and gender, but also like this position that your identity is always shifted by external evaluator. Let's say like that. For instance, if you're autistic, always somebody's going to say that either you don't look autistic or you look too autistic for this task. So it feels like your identity and your capability of doing something is always changed by this external evaluator, which is like anybody in society. And it happens in all fields of our existence, from working and dating or meeting a new friend. So it's always that we need to mask our neurodivergent traits, so we pass as normal. And even, of course, it's impossible to mask completely. And that creates this positionality in which you're always being moved from one side to the other. So in a way, it's nice to think like, how can we trick the neurotypical system by embracing that we cannot completely fit into the identity they want to give us. And then in this neuroqueer intimacies project, I wrote an article. I also did a residency at this Urban Apa, Finland, in which I produced a zine about this and also this talk in the temporary gallery. So basically, I'm investigating how neurodivergent people are kind of stigmatized in dating apps, or neuroqueer people are stigmatized in dating apps. So yeah, So that's what I have been doing, both as an artistic practice and as also research practice, but I also do other research in my position. So yeah, sorry, I have spoken too much.
For me, it's a relief if you talk and not me, so I don't have to be anxious about it. Also, you're the guest of this podcast, so this is literally a space for you. I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. And I'm fascinated by your research. For me, this was so important because I feel like, we go into the path of research and of academia because we're looking for something. And oftentimes, many people study stuff that has nothing to do with them. But when you do study something that has to do with you, you're kind of looking for yourself in this material, And you sometimes find yourself in some respect, or it helps you to understand yourself. And that's beautiful. And for me, when I read your work about neuroqueer intimacies, it was like this tiny fireworks show in my head where I was like, oh my God, like it was so beautiful, Francisco. Thank you so much, because I was really, just like, you're an excellent writer and obviously also an excellent researcher. And you describe things that I've never seen written, like maybe I have, but not really with this sharpness of terms. So like you talk, for example, about stimming toys, and I didn't know what stimming was. And I am neurodiverse, I'm a neurodivergent person, but nobody ever taught me a word for these things that I do. But everybody's told me to stop. That they did teach me that I should stop doing it. I should stop shaking my leg. For me, it's the leg. That's kind of my stimming toy. It just goes like a little rabbit all the time when I'm
I'm always
nervous.
shaking my leg. I actually right now
Exactly.
I'm trying not to shake because I know it's gonna appear on the podcast as a sound. So my legs are crossed now, so I cannot shake them.
Exactly. But it was such an important thing for me to learn what stimming was, and to just be like, oh my God, yes. And you flip all these cards in your head. You're like, I now have a word for this. And it's not a word that has a negative acception to it, because if you say it's a tick or it's a vice, like whatever, it's always kind of negative, the way that I've been taught how to conceive of this gesture. And then I read your work and I'm like, it's just there. It's just being who I am, how I am.
I think we could use it, even try to use these words and kind of subvert them. Like with many words, we did that. Like even the word queer was like some bad word in the past, but like it was kind of reappropriated somehow. So I think even we could try that. I think what happens is that these words, like I lived in Canada for like a few years, and I think in the Americas maybe there is more discussion about these things than in Europe right now, and I think that's why these words are there for a while, but right here they are kind of arriving yet. So and I think we also need to invent these words in our own languages, because like, I mean, of course I can use stimming in Finnish or Portuguese, but maybe it's also a fun process to try to translate them to our, maybe somebody already did actually. I'm quite sure, but yeah.
Yeah, it's actually a great proposition. I'm definitely going to look up if there's any particular word for it in Italian, because I'm really interested in finding out, and if not, maybe in finding one, because this is something, that it's a form of kinship. Exactly. Like neurodiversity is a form of kinship, because when somebody, even when I didn't know you, and for me, you were somebody on Instagram with whom I exchanged interesting remarks. I heard your talk, but it's always in this frontal Zoom way, so you don't really interact with this person. And then I read your article, and then immediately this kind of kinship bond forms, where it's like, you know me, you know who I am, because you describe me with your words that I lacked to describe myself. And so it's important. Like sometimes I struggle because there's a lot of critique about academia always finding words for things, and that not being necessarily a good thing, being kind of like this Linnaeus project of taxonomy that we know where it comes from and what it did. But also at the same time, it can be, if used in the right way, a way of establishing kinship relations.
And of course, I think like these kinship relations, like I agree with you completely. And also, like I'd like to include like non-human things into our practices of kinship. Like for instance, like I talk a lot about steam toys, so I think they're also like kind of my companions, like something that it's always with me on my hands that I'm holding and pressing, I'm doing, and I think like how can we decenter our practices of kinship from human-centered approaches, and also like how can we like develop practices of kinship that are like have some care embedded, but like in a way that we don't know exactly what that kinship is, but still there's a lot of care. I think for me that's the most important. Like it's not like naming the practice of kinship, but knowing that we care about each other and we can do acts of care towards each other. Like, and I think that can take so many forms that I can't even count.
Absolutely. And I love this mention of the non-human more than human, because it's something that I think it's very common to everyone, not just neurodiverse people, that you are kind of taught to lose this while growing up. But as a kid, we all have our special objects, you know, your stuffed animal, your hat, your scarf, the particular pair of boots, a raincoat, a necklace, these charged objects, as Cecilia Vicuña calls them, that you know they represent a particular way of being in the world, and that you care for them in a particular way instead of other objects, and they care for you also in a particular way, and they make you feel in a certain way, which kind of dawns you with this protective aura, and then you walk into the world and you feel a bit more sure of yourself, even if you're small or you feel small. So I'm very much with you on the need to make more space and interrogate in productive ways what this is, how to do it together as well.
Yeah, and how to live together. Like I think that for me that's the most important question. Like it seems like a question looks quite simple, but it's like how do we live together in a way that we know that there is like an unequal distribution of care in this world, and like because of so many things, because of the way our relationships are structured, because the way working life eats all our time beyond the time that we are hired to. Like it's extremely difficult, I think, to like book a meeting with somebody sometimes, and I think like it's just like a sign that the working life eating us so much, like somehow like that people don't have time to meet or to hug or kiss or whatever. I think that's quite strange, to be honest. I think we're the only animals that are born knowing that they need to do work, and that amount of work, it can become quite unlimited, and like of course that needs to be approached in a more intersectional way. Of course there's different positions of subjects and there's inequality in distribution of resources, but I think in general like nobody has time to meet and to be together and to hug or to just chat. I think I valued a lot the chit chatting.
Absolutely. That's kind of what this podcast is about, finding this time.
I like to poke people sometimes. Like I just send like a random emoji, like a raccoon, and like, oh, what does this mean? I don't know. I'm just poking and I just want to chit chat. I don't see a goal to this, but the goal is the thing itself or the chat itself, or like, yeah, because I think that's quite valuable, but people don't have time because of the society in which they are inserted into.
Absolutely. It's quite harrowing when you think of it. And we are very big proposers of chit chat and of conversations. That's why LateMode was born, because we realized we didn't have time to have interesting conversation with people that work in our field. And then you're like, then what is this work for? Who am I working for in the end, if not to share it with these people and to learn from them? If I don't have time to do this, what is my work worth?
Also, it's like I mean, for sure, it's like also some problem that emerged. Like, if you think about not only like neurodiversity or disabilities, or so, this is also a cultural issue. Like, how do you how do we count time? How do we structure our days? Or so it's like, I think we got used to a way of dividing time that for sure it's arbitrary because there are other cultures that count time differently. And like, I think maybe people do not understand that neurodiversity, it exists on us, like both biologically and socially, but also it's like a culture And I don't think people respect that enough. And sometimes it's not, as you said, it's not like it's their fault. It's more like they are in this automatic mode of reproducing this way of organizing time and work and life and love. So I think it's nice. So we can like try to poke eventually people on change a bit their habits and practices.
Poking is very important. Also because it's a bit of a process, right? It's something I got really interested because I had this, this was so serendipitous in a way. So I visited the Apple in Amsterdam, this big art institution with a wonderful archive. And in the archive of the Apple, I walked in with some colleagues from my MA, and we were talking about books that might go with our researches, blah, blah, blah. And because my personal research is about sharecropping and the memory and heritage of sharecropping, I was like, I don't know what I'm going to find in an artistic archive. And then I just turned around and glanced at the first shelf, and I see like this, like, tuck. I see this little book, and it says, the How to Go to Book of Anarchiving. And I'm like, oh, wow, that sounds really interesting. I flip through it, I get absolutely enamored, and I make sure to come the next week. The next week, we had already set up our meeting by then to have this podcast. The next week, I go back and I actually sit down and open this book. And I read Francisco Trento, among the many, many, many contributors to this book. So I've been fascinated by the How to Go to Book of Anarchiving, like properly obsessed, full ADHD style, down this rabbit hole for 2 weeks now. And it's been so important to me. And I thought, wow, I must be the luckiest person in the world because I get to speak about this with you live. So I wanted to ask you more about, first of all, anarchiving, because I feel like the How to Go to Book of Anarchiving, which was I wouldn't say the result, but something that came out of this process within this research group initiated by Brian Masumi and Erin Manning. And please tell us more about what anarchiving is.
Well, it's like it's a concept that can have so many definitions, but I think, to be honest, I think it has everything to do with cropping. You mean cropping in terms of agriculture? Or? Yeah, I'm quite interested in that. I think I would like to.
I would love to speak more.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to do cropping in Finland because of the weather. So it's quite restricted to a part of the year. But I mean, sometimes I have this desire to move to more southern Europe and try to plant things. Of course, then I need space and I need. But of course, you have these communal gardens that are really nice. Mm-hmm. In Helsinki, you have so many that are so nice, but I think I would be a bit sad because it's like it takes only a few months of your year because of the weather here, of course. Yeah. So in a way it's nice, but also sad. But anyways, this unarchived book we did there was this project that Erin and Brian applied for this grant, and they received like the biggest grant in Canada, and that was possible by then. And then one of the concepts that would be approached in this grant was the unarchive. So basically, the anarchive comes from the name comes from anarchic share, which comes from Whitehead, which is I'm not going to try to explain now because mostly I have a really hard time understanding Whitehead. But
I think most of us do. Everybody loves him, but we're not really sure why. I think
if you get like the Process and Reality is like a huge book, and it's like if you read a page 20 times, I think I have a really time understanding.
I've tried that before.
I need to understand what it is, but I think for me, the unarchive does what typical archives do not do. Like typical archives are, even if they are not technically, because Derrida talks a lot about the archives, that they are not stable, that they are live, that they change, that they're subject to rules of discourse, to rules of the epoch in which they're created. But the unarchive is like, how can we archive things that cannot be archived? So how can we archive traces of events, like an affect that emerged between us right now, but it's not recorded in this conversation, but it is a spark that will generate new events and new meetings and new contributions. So how do we work with these sparks or these traces that are left, which are not usually recorded in the archives? And for instance, like if you think about the archives of slavery, for instance, of course, the official archive will not record the effects of suffering and the resistance that was created during that period of time. But of course, these sparks are still somewhere, and they can activate resistance nowadays. And of course, that doesn't work not only with slavery, but like mostly with everything that's eaten by the institutional archives. So one thing that we started as the proposal of the anarchive was this anarchival room, which was called the Space in Sense Lab. So we had that room, which is basically an office of the research group, and since they got the grant, the university gave a big room for them, but it was basically an office and was full of like art supplies, also past art pieces from people who passed through there, residents and whatever, and everything was kind of stored in these shelves. And one day we started to like, first we tried to set up this garden with these pots that were hanging on the wall, and like kind of creating a network of pots with plants. But then we started like taking everything out of the shelves and trying to put and rearrange together. And that started to be a practice. So every day we would go there. We had no obligation, but we started to rearrange the room in a way that it would make us feel safer. So for instance, people who are neurodivergent or neurodiverse, they do not want to experience frontality in the class. So we created some kind of environment that had corners and tunnels and etc. So basically, we had reorganized these objects every day. And this reorganization happened like it always left some traces for the following day, like with traces that would not be visible on the room, but they were visible on the shared appetites of that group. So some days we'll feel, oh, it's more like a crunching day. So everything would come and become like more like a package of things that are together. And some days it's like more like a expanding day. So things were like kind of scattered into like so many things, like then started to get some adding up other objects, which are quite simple objects, but that we would get from Dollarama, the dollar store. And like we started to rearrange it. And we kind of developed this environment in which it's really a shared environment in which we could change it according to our appetites and according to our different ways of perceiving the world. So I think the anarchive is like a practice of trying to catch up with the traces that were left and trying to make them into sparks of developing new ways of being together, or new ways of building a house or a home, or like how can we together raise a crop, or how do we together can grow crops and organize them, like how can we do some co-op maybe.
I love it. It's first of all, thank you so much for this great explanation, because having read the book, I really feel like it resonates with everything I've read by also being a lot more concise. So congratulations. This was amazing. I wasn't obviously expecting you to be so successful, but you've been very successful at this explanation. So thank you so, so much. And now with this basis of what anarchiving is, I really do know that the reason I vibed so much with it when I first saw this book, and I really had this feeling like I opened it and I started reading and I was like, oh my God, this book found me. Because I've been working on a project and an essay for a course and been so majorly stuck for more than a month now, because I have an idea of what I want to say and I have this big brainstorm, but I just couldn't find this one red thread to tie it all together. And then an archive as a notion and anarchiving as a practice came in, and I was like, this is it. This is what I've been doing on a major scale, I feel like, because this podcast is also just that, you know? It's about taking a trace from a conversation that was, without taking it as an archival object that needs to be preserved inside the plastic bag. You just take this trace, maybe you listen to the other conversation, maybe not, up to you, and then you try to make it into a spark for a new conversation, for it to move forward, which is also, for me, obviously, the only worthwhile way of working with an archive.
Yeah, of course. I think it's the only way that is not excruciating for us also.
Absolutely. And that also, I mean, I've been doing archival research into the archives of this museum in the region my mother is from, which is where kind of like the case study for my major research about sharecropping.
Where is your mother from?
She's from Abruzzo.
Okay.
So on the East Coast. And in the Museo delle Genti d'Abruzzo, which is an ethnographic museum of Abruzzo's people, I've spent the best part of my summer going through everything they had in there, old pictures, diapositives. And there was so much, like, the museum is amazing and its stuff is amazing, and it's been built on a very surprisingly open and thoughtful and self-reflective anthropological stance. But it is still an ethnographic museum and you are still in an archive, so the violence abounds. At one point I was just going through these diapositives and I found myself staring into the eyes of a woman who had died in an earthquake, and her picture and her body were just like sprayed over this picture. And I was like, whoa. And I had this super strong reaction, like, this shouldn't be here. Like, these people shouldn't be able to hold the body of this woman hostage for anybody like me who just gets a university pass to walk in and look at her. And, it feels like there's some kind of insincerity in the way that you are allowed to use the archive as a scholar. You just go in, you look, you go out, and you talk about it in a way that is not as upsetting. So anything in there that is violence, you're not supposed to talk about, you're not supposed to take action against, you're not supposed to rebel or, subvert. And it's just like cooperating with silence, it just makes you...
That's a pretty violent act in itself that we are forced to do when we need to comply with this.
Exactly. I feel like anarchiving is such a powerful notion in which to think new ways of engaging with archives that refuse to just witness violence and shut up about it.
Yeah, and I think also like we can use anarchive for other things too. Like how can we anarchive the crops, communal living? Or how can we anarchive our relationships? Like, yeah, I don't know. It's something that came into my mind now.
It's a very interesting question, and it's worth spending some time on, I think. Like, how can we unarchive our relationships?
I think one of the books that stayed with me for a very long time is this Angela Willey's Undoing Monogamy, in which she kind of criticizes both how these structures of non-monogamy, they're like understood as absolute truths from different perspectives, from biology or religion or so, like, but they're quite structured in a way that they're unmutable somehow. Like, so it's kind of, they are mirrored, monogamy and non-monogamy, and she kind of tried to invent something else, like this kind of anti-monogamy, and she goes to this book which is like the Essential to Die For, which is, I think, Alison Bechdel's comic book, and it's like, it's kind of describe this community of lesbians, but not only lesbians, like people, and like they kind of live in this organization in which the type of engagement they had with each other always shift. But that's not the problem of the thing or the issue. It's like more like they manage to reinvent the way they are together all the time. So if it doesn't really matter if they're once lovers and then friends, or friends and then lovers, and that doesn't generate a hierarchy in that environment or in that community. So like they kind of invented a way of living together and also bringing people that are outside their circles into their communities, and kind of like living this some sort of non-hierarchized way in which everybody can get care regardless of the type of connection they have to each other, and regardless of the potentialities of that connection to change. Of course, you can be just platonic with somebody and then get romantic and sexual, and the opposite can also happen. But that's not the thing that doesn't change the organization in the way that the person gets excluded from that environment. And then other people start to come into that environment. It's mostly dykes, but also like even men, and like they're animals, and so, and they kind of all start to live in a way that things are shared regardless of the type or the name of the connection in which people have. And that's what they call like anti-monogamy. It's more like, it's not non-monogamy, but it's not also monogamy. It's more like a different kind of societal organization in which we can do this communal living, and we can take seriously the necessities that everybody has. And that, of course, it connects a lot to disability, because like I think with the discourse on disability always hidden or not hidden, like they frame like disabled people as like some sort of burden, so some sort of attractor that will suck all the time and energy that somebody has. And that's like, I think the problem is that people see disabled people as burdens that will suck all the energy of a community, but it's quite the opposite. I think the problem is that we don't have communities that embrace people that are non-able, and that we don't have communities that, or we have, but just not many, that embrace people who have different temporalities. And then, of course, if you're like, I think like there is this question also of collective mothering, like how did we reach this situation in which we think it's normal for just two people to take care of a child for like 20 years? That doesn't make any sense, you know, like I think that applies to every situation. Like one person cannot be taken care of by only other two people, and that kind of should become like a network of care or whatever. But in a way, like how can we anarchive the relations that we have right now so they become like more conscient of the unequal distribution of care? And I don't know.
I really appreciate this so much. Thank you.
That's
for
connected to
bringing this
land
up.
because we need space.
Exactly.
So
And it's not like space is not there, you know, like everybody who's listening to this podcast must have at least once, either if it was Spain, Japan, or Italy, seen spam email, image, or advertisement about villages with €1 homes. I mean, you all know this. And this happens because there is effectively a lot of communities where people just don't live anymore. The land is available, it's just what it's done with it and who keeps owning it. Even though, you know, it's for me, it's a big part of my research because this community, I look into sharecroppers, so people who live on a land that they do not own, and each month they give half of the harvest to a landowner. These people like lived on huge properties owned by nobility. And then you're like, oh, but there was the unification of Italy, the Italian Republic, nobility doesn't exist anymore. But then if you look at actual research, you can see that the same four families that were at the top of the pops of the wealth in 1400 Florence are the same ones at the top of the pop of the wealth today. This land that used to belong to colonial overlords, the real estate property, it rarely changes within centuries. Like, you know, so there's a lot of land that is still owned within epistemic systems or ways of conceiving of life that are no longer.
Yeah. And they're mostly like unused. And that's the most annoying thing, because it's not that these people are using the land or using even for conservation of nature. They're not. It's just there. It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense. And this is actually the project that Anarchive book found me to help me with, I feel like, is exactly this. So I'm working on this field that is in Abruzzo, in front of the house of my mother, that used to belong to the people that owned the land as sharecropping when she lived there as a sharecropper. This field has been unused for 40 years. The only thing that is done to it is that when the grass gets so tall that the neighborhood gets scared that the snakes are going to go in there, whatever, they call the police calls the owner, and they're forced to pay for somebody to cut the grass, because otherwise it becomes like public safety issue. But besides that, nothing is done with it. And there's super ancient olive groves on it that are beautiful and could be harvested every year, but are not. And so I was thinking, like, churning this in my head, like how to work with this field, what to do with this field. And then I found the How to Go to book of Anarchiving. And I was like, this, my friend, is no coincidence. This book found me for a reason, because I needed it. And I am going to read this and I'm going to come up with an idea. And this, together with Reenchanting the World by Silvia Federici, I feel like these two books will take me to an interesting conclusion. And so this is to say, I'm very much thinking with you that the issue of how to unarchive systems is intimately tied to the land. Because recently I was having a chat with somebody who mentioned this word. It was Lara Caldi, and she referred to as the lack of space and encroachment upon space by neoliberal realities as the spatial question. And I thought this is the most brilliant way to put it, because it encompasses so much, you know? Instead of it being a local problem in Abruzzo or a local problem in Amsterdam where there's the housing crisis, you call it the spatial question, and you understand that we're talking about a reality we share in many different realities, in many places of the world, but that concerns us all. This is an issue, and we do need to find alternatives to it together, because we cannot have places be disinhabited and unserviced and with zero prospects for jobs and for life, and other places like cities like Amsterdam, where people are like living in student halls with zero services and mice and paying 580 euros a month for it as well.
Yeah. I think it's like we need to find a way to reinvent space and time. I think our questions go back to that, because if we don't have where to meet and time to meet, then we cannot have action. We cannot propose something like so. And it's not that they do not exist; they exist. They are there. Time is and space are here. I mean, we are creatures who live in time and space, but they are kind of stolen and eaten from us. So the way that we cannot organize ourselves, but we need to invent somehow some ways of reorganizing these things.
Absolutely. I agree with you so much. I also think that that is such a beautiful starting point. Like if I could, I would place a milestone right here, right now that says reinventing time and space. And from there, I would love to work together aimlessly and see where it goes. But I also think it's so interesting to, when you actually think about it, what is a space and what is time? Like these are nothing but conventions that we agree upon with each other. So reinventing them, making so that they actually can be shared with other people, maybe it's a complex project, but reinventing them per se as the concept that in truth they are, because if we follow the Certeau, what is space? Nothing but a practice place. So I can go anywhere, walk around or sit down. I say I'm practicing it and this is suddenly a space, whether it's mine or not, that's irrelevant. It became a space in the moment where I practiced it. And what is time if not like a convention, like a way to account for the way that reality is perceived by a singular organism in this moment? So these notions are so films me that reinventing them is no big deal at all. We just have to do it. And it makes me think a lot about Lanthimos' film Dogtooth, where this family is kept captive by this extremely violent father that tells them stories about the outside world. Like this is literally what neoliberal capitalism is doing to us. Like it's this father, like it takes nothing to reinvent time and space, but to step outside the house, to dare do that.
Yeah, I think like one thing that I'd like to develop a lot is like in the Sense Lab in Canada, we used to call that space that we organize all the time the spas. And I think my idea is like always like how do I do something like that in a different place? I'm not living in Canada anymore, like but because like literally just what we need is space and time. I mean, if we had like a maybe we can use this space in Abruzzo, for instance, and to develop some sort of.
I would love that. You are most invited. This is an official invitation. I did a little tryout this summer. I organized this thing that I called Foresteria Artistica, because in Italian, I don't know if you are familiar with Italian mountains, but there's this thing in Italian mountains called foresterie. And a foresteria is basically just a building that you are walking in the mountains, it's getting dark, you don't have a tent, and you go look for this building and they take you always. They give you a bed, a bowl of soup for a very small price, and that's it. So I was like, okay, what if I were to do this, since I'm down here doing research for 2 months and there's a family home where I'm alone so I can fit other people. I do this for my colleagues in the research masters of artistic research. So I told them, you're invited. Come whenever you want, as long as you tell me 2 days before so I can wash you the sheets. You can just drop by, stay however long you want, and then you leave. And over the course of 2 months, 15 people came and stayed with me. And it was really great. But of course, they were staying short time. So we didn't really manage to work together so much yet. Just talking, chit-chatting with each other about our projects, which was extremely valuable. But I thought, I want to do this again because I need to work with this space because something has to be done.
I think like the longer you stay with the space, you start to observe like how the sparks are staying. So like it would be nice, like perhaps at least a year or like even permanent. Like even if you are not there, you continue to live somehow. Yeah.
You read my mind. I've been doing a lot of work about this, about how to be there without being there and how to leave traces behind and seeing how this field in particular deals with them. And as you said, it's a way of being with the place or with the space, right? It's a process. So you just start looking at it differently. This thing that maybe you always kind of zoned out of your perception. You know, this concept that came into my life through your work, this is perfect because if you think about neuroqueerness as this positionality that is in a constant flux, depending on its surroundings, then this is really inclusive to everyone, be you neurodivergent or neurotypical, because you cannot be excluded by something that is constantly fluctuating, you know, as long as it's a fixed category that presupposes two poles, then somebody's always going to be left out.
Yeah, and I think there's like two sides of the thing. One is like, it's nice to be in constant flux and challenge a bit the fixed structure, but also like it is emerged because neurodivergent people are always being moved against their own desires and have their identities moved or being physically moved even. So I think neuroqueerness, or the idea of being neuroqueer, is also how do we subvert that, you know, how do we fight that uncomfortable, uninvited moving of ourselves into a different category or a different space that we don't necessarily want to go.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And I think it would take a whole other podcast to wrap our hands around it together. But I hope that the listeners of this podcast can find it interesting food for thought for them to wrap around in their daily commute or bath or in whichever condition you're listening to this podcast. So I thank you very much for your time, Francisco. And to everybody who is listening, thank you so much for the time and the attention you've put into listening to this. If you are neurodiverse, I know that means a lot. And if you're just busy or tired, it's the same thing. Neurodiverse or neurotypical, the gift of your time is always something we take into account and we give a lot of love to. So before we leave this little space we have created, I would like to ask you to leave behind the theme for the next person that will come after you.
Perhaps
slowness. Slowness. Ooh, very nice. I think whoever gets this is going to enjoy it quite a bit, regardless of their path of life. We really hope you enjoy taking it slow on the next episode. Okay, Francisco, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was really lovely. I look forward to many more conversations.
Me too. Yeah, we'll keep in touch. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If you want to dive deeper into the show, don't forget to check the podcast description for extra resources, contact information, and a sign-up form for our newsletter. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and until next time, take care.